Welcome. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar where we were looking at the very important subject of church heating, something which understandably draws a lot of interest. Now we've got a pair of church heating webinars. Today's topic 1, which is replace or not replace, and today is the second run of that topic 1. And then on Thursday, and again in a few weeks' time, we're running topic 2, which is about how to choose the right heating system. So it's okay, we've decided we do need to replace. How do we think through how to choose the right heating system? So today's topic 1, you might have questions which really are better answered by topic 2. So we might not cover everything that you need today, but please do come back and join us for the second topic. I always begin with the trailer of upcoming attractions, and the first of those is part 2, church heating system. So that's this Thursday, May the 4th, and then toward the end of June. So we're running it twice to give you 2 chances to find a time that works for you. We've then changing topics slightly. We have got a session themed around the Great Big Green Week, which is coming up in June, which is about how to use the Great Big Green Week to engage your local politicians in climate action. And then that first full week in June, we're into Churches Count on Nature. So that's the time in the year when we encourage church communities to get out in their churchyards and record the wonderful biodiversity that they see in their churchyards. And at the same time, we do national webinars themed around land and nature. So we've got 5 this year: churchyard management, good examples from around the country, paying attention to nature. That's with our lead bishop on the environment, Bishop Graham Usher. EcoTeric, the land section, and from global to local, tackling the twin crises for climate and nature. Really encourage you to come along to those webinars. They're at lunchtime every day, Monday to Friday, during the week of Churches Count on Nature. We're then running our webinar on church solar panels again. That's on June the 20th, and not a webinar, but a whole training day. If you missed the heat pump training in March, we're running it again in October. That's a whole day of online training all about heat pumps. Right. The usual housekeeping today for any of our webinars. So using the Q&A for questions rather than the chat. And when you go into the Q&A, you'll see the little thumbs up sign. You can click that. That's to vote for someone else's question, and the ones with the most votes rise to the top. Given how many of you are here today, it's quite likely that we will not get through all the questions. So please, before you type yours in, do have a look and see if there's a similar question and do a thumbs up next to that one. That might be the best way to get your question answered. After the webinar, we'll be sending everybody the slides and any links from the chat. I'll try and get that done before I finish today, but I'm not promising, so it might be slightly later in the week. And we record our webinars and we share them through our website where you booked on to the webinar, and also the YouTube playlist. Most importantly, who are you hearing from today? You are hearing from Susan Logan, who you are in very, very safe hands today, very experienced hands. So Susan is a chartered building services engineer, more than 40 years of experience in the field, advising on energy efficiency, on energy efficient solutions, on heating, including 15 years as the heating advisor for Worcester Diocese. Also very recently completed some case studies of viable heating options for some churches in St Albans Diocese. There's very little to do with church heating that Susan has not come across. So let me stop sharing my slides, which means that Susan can share hers and take us away.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for the introduction. So let's hope I'm going to get onto the right screen, because I've got an awful lot of options here, but let's go with it. And hopefully that all looks good.
Yep, you're away.
And we're away. So yes, it's a tricky subject. It's a difficult subject. And sometimes before we go too far, we really need to step back and think, what is it we're trying to achieve? And do we really need to replace our heating? And that's what today is all about. And of course, as Catherine has said, there is a complementary session, which is more about, if we have decided to replace, what are we going to replace with? There is a little bit of overlap between the two, but this one is more about our initial thinking. So I'm in a little bit of trouble because it's not. Has that moved on, Catherine?
No, we're still on your title slide. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Sorry, Jesus, it didn't move on initially. So it is really important that we don't lose sight of what church is about. I do this advisory role because it's important for church, it's important for people, it's important for our faith. If we don't consider people, we don't have a church. But at the same time, if we don't address climate change, we don't look after creation. So we have to walk the tightrope between these two priorities. Now, post-COVID, we've had even more problems. Our congregation can be down in places. I think they are starting to recover to an extent, but our income in our church is probably down. Our energy bills are higher, sometimes catastrophically so. Since I did the first presentation of this in March, there is some relief on the horizon probably. But even so, our heating and lighting is certainly costing us a lot more. Our circumstances might have changed. Churches are increasingly having to amalgamate or face closure, and we may need to make some hard decisions. And our bills and our heating are all part of that equation. So what we've got to do is set some clear priorities and be very clear-sighted about what it is that we want and need. And from heating, you know, it might be a fairly fundamental question, but are we warm? And for us, what does warm mean? Does that mean, for example, when we've got a church full of children running around, or is warm sitting in coats? What is warm? Are our visitors and users warm enough for what they want to do and to feel welcome in our church? What do we want to achieve? So it's really important to define what we want. What do we want? Do we want a growing church that's accessible to all parts of the community? Do we want to stay with our traditions and more occasional use? We have really got to think that through. What does the building need to preserve it? Now, you could talk for I could talk for an awful long time about preservation, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. But except in quite rare circumstances, most buildings are okay with lower levels of heating. What can we afford? And that's now and in the future. So our clear goals come from clear needs. Most people will be familiar with the statement of needs, and it's as applicable and as important to heating as it is to any other form of faculty application. What are we going to need in the future? So are we planning any changes to the building? Are we planning reordering and so on? We will come into that in a bit. How often do we use the building? Is that going to change? Do we use it once a fortnight, 6 times a week? These things bring about radical differences in the choices we might make for our heating. Who will use the building in the future? Are we going to have concerts? Is it going to be a post office? Could it be a cafe? All these things, again, we need to write that down and focus our thoughts on it. And very, very importantly, and this will be looked at whenever we're looking to make any changes, have we got a plan for carbon? And there's some links there, such as the Climate Emergency Toolkit there, which will help you walk through a plan for carbon. We'll talk more about that again further on the presentation. And then we think about who will use the building. So are we going to let parts of it to clubs and societies? Are we going to have lunch clubs? Are we going to have advice sessions? Are we going to use it for toddler groups? What ages and abilities? Because that, again, there's risks we might need to think about hot surfaces or trip hazards. What will people expect from us? Will they expect a modern, comfortable environment, or would they be quite happy with a traditional church-like environment? And risks and needs must come into it, particularly when we're dealing with vulnerable members of the community. Some more questions. How do we use the building? How often is it used? A church that's used once a month, twice a month, can accept a very different type of heating solution from one that is used regularly, because when we don't use it very often, then we can afford perhaps to heat with direct electricity, whereas if we're using it very often, that may prove totally unaffordable. How many people use it? I always ask when I go on a church visit, you know, what's the number of your typical congregation? Obviously, there's always peak congregations, but we're more interested in what happens most of the time. And is there an alternative to using the main space, particularly in winter? If we regularly get 6 to 12 people, should we heat the whole church, or should we consider a chapel or some other facility if it's available? And how can spaces be used? How can we perhaps section off small places? How can we actually move around? We need to think about that. Some churches, of course, it's important to have the ability to move around the church. And that again affects what we might think in terms of our heating. And then, as we touched on earlier, what does the building need to preserve it? So first and foremost, are the listed or precious interiors or artifacts. So this would come into the wall paintings, perhaps some particularly important timber that might need something called conservation heating, and that will require a steady heat and humidity, which is quite different to the sort of heating we might look at just for people and comfort. Sometimes a lot of rapid heating and cooling brings about damage to stonework. You can see some examples in the photos there. And this is by moisture continually moving in and out of the stonework. And sometimes that can cause problems, and it might be better to be more stable than for rapid heating and cooling. So what do we need to preserve the building? More often than not a lot from the heating system. More often than not, it's dealing with the exterior causes of damp and mold, guttering, roof leakage and the like, rather than trying to heat your way out of it. But it is important to involve our architects colleagues in that, so that we don't go to the wrong sort of solution. And then we need to think about, lastly, there's a lot of questions there, but what sort of church are we? So here's a graph that comes from the one of the Church of England publications that looks at our priorities. This is from shrinking the footprint. And you'll see there the average CO2 for a large urban church is radically different to a small rural church. And this is where, so the priority for the Church of England in overall footprint clearly is going to be at the larger church end, and the churches to use more often. And what will be acceptable as a heating solution will depend to an extent on the type of church we are. And so it's important to define ourselves when we're looking at these things. And to start thinking, so all this might seem a bit much to you, think, well, where do I start with that? Well, thankfully, there's a practical path to net zero checklist, which captures just about everything I've talked about so far. So help is at hand on this one. So we've defined who we are, what we are, how we use it, what we want to do in the future. So we should have now a good idea of the needs we need to meet, not necessarily how to meet them, but at least we know what the needs are. And the next thing is to look at what we've actually got. the lesser visited parts of the church, let's face it. And the majority of churches will have had some kind of Victorian makeover at some point. A lot of them have a subterranean or semi-subterranean undercroft where would have been a coal or coke boiler, and more modern or slightly more modern boilers have been put in the same sort of location, with the sort of tanks you can see in that photo there, which are unfortunately tend sometimes to be of the organ, where they not infrequently burst and cause untold damage. So these locations are less suitable really for modern equipment. Where is the boiler? Is it in a damp area or an area which gets flooded? Unfortunately, modern microprocessors that go with modern heating equipment, whether it's heat pumps or boilers, are not very good at dealing with damp locations. So quite often we need to look at what we've got, where it is, and also consider the health and safety of people that might need to go down there to look at it as well, because sometimes the access is not very good either. So that's one thing we do need to have a look at. Where are the tanks that feed the system? We've got different sorts of tanks. The tanks you will encounter are the ones that supply water to the system, and also the tanks that might hold oil or gas. And there's a lot of safety issues around that. I regularly come across tanks that have no mains water. Somebody has to fill them up with a bucket. Now, that is potentially extremely dangerous. It's not to modern standards, and in the catastrophic event of the boiler overheating, its thermostat going wrong, for example, you could generate steam within the system, and in the extreme event, you could actually have an explosion. A lesser likelihood is a catastrophic emission of steam and water, which could cause a lot of damage, as well as potentially being unsafe for anybody in the vicinity. Same with electrics, quite a lot of unsafe electrics knocking around, and tanks like the one in the picture there, which can leak and cause environmental damage if it gets into the ground and water courses. So have we got a safe, modern, efficient system? Have we got things like gas safety systems, oil safety systems that cut off in the event of fire? So some more questions. How old is it? Memories, of course, are not entirely reliable. I was confidently told that a boiler was dated from the 1960s. It's actually dated from the 1990s, but it was still old enough. If a heating system is much beyond 20 years, it is at the end or nearing the end of its useful service life. Of course, in churches, you quite frequently see 30 or 40-year-old equipment. The heating system lasts longer than the boiler. So a boiler book life is about 15 to 20 years. A heating system, of course, 30 to 50, but we still have some perfectly serviceable Victorian heating systems that are well over 100 years old and still okay. How do we know whether it's okay or not? Does it leak? It's as simple as that. If a system is starting to leak, particularly a very old system, it's pulling air in, and it'll almost certainly be starting to deteriorate. So leakage is one of the key signs that a heating system is at the end of its life. The boiler, of course, will tell you when it's starting to get to the end of its life, because it'll start to fail or become unreliable, difficult to light. Parts are starting to get hard to get a hold of. How long does it take to warm up is a really good question. We have to have it on all night to get warm. That's a sign that a heating system is either undersized or it's just not putting out the heat that it used to. Is the building damp? well, again, we come back to, you can't necessarily blame the heating for that. It can be external sources, but there are potentially some clues as to heating that is on its way out. 20 years old, electric heating where the wiring's not too great. Flues and ventilation. There's a photo there of a boiler that has some clearly a hot spot there, which is a sign of some failure, and that's a real bad warning sign. Have we got, as I say, safety systems? Have we got obsolete systems that we can't actually maintain anymore? No water supply, noisy failed heaters, blockages and leaks. So we can do a bit of diagnosis, can't we, ourselves? And the maintenance, the people that maintain our systems, it's well worth talking to them to see what they think as well. So we've had a look at our system. We've formed some views as to whether it's on the wear out. We've talked to the people that maintain it. Don't always take the first opinion, of course. It may be in the interest of a contractor to recommend replacement when in fact an upgrade is perfectly possible. So I always say don't necessarily feel you've got to rip something out on the first opinion. But also we need to think about changes to the building. Now I've got a picture there of a single pipe system. These are very commonly used in churches. Funnily enough, they just have one pipe running around instead of two. So you can identify them fairly well. And they were always designed for a single space. Excuse me. And they work quite well in a single space. As soon as you start taking them to other spaces, they don't work so well, because when you come from the boiler here, the water's quite hot and it gets progressively cooler as we go around the system. So if you've got your radiator off in the vestry right at the end of the system, your bicker could be quite cold getting changed. They're also not very adaptable. So if we're going to start changing our heating, single pipe systems are really quite difficult to change because of the way they're designed. So if we're doing a lot of reordering, I think we now need to think about single pipe system. That might not be so good. And then changes to the building. Can heat be delivered where it's needed? Very often the centre of churches, and the picture there is a classic of where the pews have been removed. There's a lot of chairs, but there's nowhere to put heating equipment. So it can be really quite difficult to heat the centre of the church. So we need to think about how we do that. Whereas sometimes if we keep our pews, and the picture there shows some little black under pew heaters, you can heat people. So sometimes, I mean, if we may need to remove pews for a whole load of other reasons, but we do have to think carefully about how we get heat to the centre of the space and how we get heat to where people are. I was mentioning passing some heritage issues because there are important heating equipment that may be part of the listing, and even if it isn't, it's of interest within the church. So there's no reason why you can't keep old equipment in situ and put new equipment over the top of it. There's a few pictures there of Victorian radiators, of Victorian stoves that it's not functional anymore. Some are, some aren't. But we should probably think about keeping those in situ because they are of interest often to the original fabric of the church. And cast iron radiators, you know, they're great, really. They can be restored. They provide an awful lot of heat for very little wall space. They warm up slowly for sure, but they cool down slowly too. So if anybody tells you they're inefficient, that isn't necessarily the case. They are efficient if you use them correctly with an efficient heat source. So we don't necessarily have to get rid of those. We might choose to repipe them, we might choose, certainly they're not efficient if they're full of sludge, but that can be dealt with. So here's a nice picture there of sludged up pipework. So clearly you're not going to get a lot of heat out of that. So an old boiler, just to summarise on this section really, An old boiler equals wasted energy, without doubt. Brand new, a boiler put in the 80s, right through probably to the mid 90s, would have been maybe about 84% efficient when it was brand new and in excellent condition. A modern boiler, equivalent boiler, I know we're talking about boilers and we're going to talk about other heat sources too, but here is about sort of whether we replace or not. So the most common thing we are replacing is a boiler. A modern boiler, if you were to put a new one in, necessarily going to do that, but if you were, it would be 96% efficient. So in broad terms, an old boiler probably now, 20, 30, 40 years old, is probably 70% efficient at best. So what we're saying is between an old boiler and a new boiler, you're putting with the old boiler, you're putting 25% of your money up the chimney, which is not a particularly good thing to do. A leaky system is always poor efficiency because of the sludge that we're building up and the fact that you are degrading a system with fresh water. Fresh water in heating systems is a really bad idea. It's got lots of oxygen in it and it causes all sorts of sludge and further leakage and corrosion. And if we're having to put it on overnight, we're definitely wasting energy. We'll talk later about how you think about heating energy and how much it costs. But just plant in your minds for now that the longer something is running, the more it's costing you, one way or another. The shorter time it's running, to achieve, of course, the same level of comfort, the less money it's costing. Here's a few more photographs of the sort of things I encounter. The boiler on the left-hand side there looks a bit like a face, dates from the 60s. It's almost certainly got some asbestos in the joints. So, and it would probably be about 50% efficient if you're lucky. Cast iron pipework there, you can see on the stains of the wood that's starting to leak. And then a very typical atmospheric boiler, a little bit later, but still probably 80% efficient if you're lucky. So we've looked at what makes heating inefficient. So now what makes it efficient? So there's a few things. Delivering heat to where people are. So rather than necessarily heating the underside of the roof or heating the outside air through drafts, we want to get heat to where people are actually sitting or standing or doing whatever they're doing. Avoiding big swings in temperature can be quite inefficient. That isn't always the case. So we come back to our church that we only use once a fortnight, and we can probably accept that that will have a big swing in temperature. But if we're using it more often, it's probably more efficient to operate the heating between a band of maybe 12 or 13 to 17 or 18, whatever we're trying to achieve. Definitely more efficient is reducing the space we need to heat. Now, I understand that we have large churches and few people very often, so that is not always possible, but there is a concept of winter church and summer church where we may have to be forced to use a smaller space in winter for the number of people that are there. And we need to think about that long and hard, really. Reducing the time the system is on. So if the building is warm, we could probably afford to turn the heating off half an hour before we leave it, because if it's particularly with the cast iron radiators, it'll cool down naturally. An efficient heat source, of course, and good controls. So I'm not going to really talk to this slide, but this is where the resources, some of the resources are. We've got our practical path not to net zero. We've got our EcoTeric. We've got our climate emergency. We've got a whole lot of tools that we can use to determine how efficient we are. Excuse me. So then we go on to the principles of carbon in heating, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reduce carbon. Why are we trying to reduce carbon? Because it brings about climate change. How do we reduce carbon? The first thing is the demand should be reduced. The demand should be reduced as far as possible. How do we reduce demand? Well, all the ways we've just talked about: heating smaller spaces for less time and delivering heat to a usefully to people, rather than necessarily heating a large space. So once we've reduced our demand, how else might we reduce our demand as well? Well, we might try and insulate. I haven't talked about that too much, but wherever possible, we should insulate or occupy a well-insulated space. There are always opportunities. I don't think I've ever been to a church where there hasn't been an opportunity to do something. It might be quite modest, such as lining a duct. We will come on to that a little bit later. So once we've reduced our demand, then our supply should be as close as possible to our demand, because if something is oversized, it's going to tend to be using more energy. And heating, of course, should come from the lowest possible carbon source. And so we will talk a little bit about the carbon in different heating sources a little bit further on. So what does this mean in practice? Insulate. Here's a photo, top right hand, of the very common underfloor ducts that we find that used to have big pipes in them, or used to have warm air from coke boilers. And it's usually pretty efficient and quite cheap to insulate those. Have a discussion with your inspecting architect about whether vents can be partially blocked. Building still needs to breathe, but the Victorian buildings and Victorian reordering introduce a lot of fresh air for a very crowded congregation, potentially gas lighting. We really don't need that level of ventilation anymore. If you are replacing your roof, then always insulate, as long as it is practically possible to do so. That will always produce some good savings and obviously stop drafts. Now, carbon then. So carbon is measured in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. Sometimes we are putting out carbon dioxide, but sometimes we're putting out something else that is equally damaging to the environment. And it's a little bit small, I know, but this graph shows the comparative carbon of different energy sources. So our renewables are zero carbon. If we burn wood, it is low carbon. There are disadvantages with burning wood, but it is nonetheless a renewable or regenerative heat source. Heat pumps come in next. Now, they are powered by electricity. Yes, they are. But they use electricity more efficiently. So for typically every kilowatt you put in, you should get at least 2.5 to 3, maybe more depending, kilowatts out. So we reduce the carbon accordingly. Here comes gas. Our colour gas is liquid petroleum gas there, colour gas. Electricity, you'll see, is starting now to be on a parity with gas. It's not long before it's going to be well below gas in carbon. And then we get our typical heating oil up here. I haven't included coal, but of course that is worse. There is a possibility of a greener gas grid with possible injections of biogas and hydrogen. But I think there's a lot of environmental debate on that at the moment, and I don't think we can necessarily rely on it. I don't definitely think that we can't rely on a pure hydrogen network anytime soon for our churches, and particularly those in rural areas. And biomass is a possibility in rural areas, but has air quality issues, as you probably know, in urban areas where there's quite a lot of particulate matter that comes from the boiler. But I would always say to a rural church, particularly a church that would have access to a regular source of biomass, that to have a think about it. So the future of hydrogen, there's no one size fits all, as it says. Hydrogen may be in the mix, but at the moment, hydrogen, to be truly green, has to be created from renewable electricity, and the vast majority of hydrogen currently is generated from gas, so it's not it's not really viable right now. I don't know where the future is going to be, hold on that, but I don't think we can rely on it. So as a principle, what do we choose? The lowest carbon source for the life of the system. So what to choose? Well, obviously, I'm going to cover that on my other seminar, but these are the questions. What fuel do we have now? Do we have single or three-phase electricity? Now that's really important, because if you don't have three-phase electricity, your choices are going to be more limited, because the amount of electricity you need to heat a church is an awful lot more than you need to power it or to do the lights, and you might not have enough capacity. What's available? How is it delivered? So if we've got, how can we get, for example, biomass to the church, and so on. I'm not going to cover that in too much detail, because that is the subject of the next So we're going to start to look at the choices on the next one. So here we're looking at heat pumps and so on. I have had a number of questions when I've delivered these topics or similar topics. Well, what about embodied carbon? Surely there's a lot of carbon goes into making the products. Yes, indeed it does. And there's some a little bit of a graph there. And if you look at, probably not reading too much detail, but if you look at the pale green is what the system uses in its life. That's the stuff that goes through the meter. That's our gas or electricity that goes through the meter. The rest of the embodied carbon is actually pretty low. The only other issue is to do with refrigerants, which is the dark green, because refrigerants can be pretty potent greenhouse gases. So we do need to think about that as we think about systems. But generally, you'll see that a low leakage air source heat pump there is got a very low embodied carbon. So should I repair or replace? Well, it depends. Could we afford a lower carbon system given time? What we don't want to do is get into a situation where we are forced to make a choice that is not good in the long term. So if we've got a plan and a sink fund, then we are prepared for the day when that person there tells us our boiler is no longer fit for use and is condemned. We don't want to be in that situation. So often I am having to give advice to churches where the boiler has actually failed. And we have to have some difficult conversations about what would be acceptable. How much is it used? Is it good money after bad? Have we had to repair several times? And as I said before, a second opinion is often worthwhile. A second opinion where we can perhaps eke out the life of a system a little bit longer to be able to make a better choice can be very, very valuable. So to sum up on this one, does it work reliably? Does it keep us warm? Does it heat up quickly enough? Can it be controlled to heat just the spaces we need? Should we be using a more efficient space? So if we can answer yes to most of those, then perhaps we don't replace it. We think about other ways of reducing carbon. Can we be adapted to potential changes? Is it likely to fail? And that's the key question. Of course, we don't know, and if somebody says how much life I got left in the system, it's a bit like a doctor. You don't really know. You know that on the balance of probability it will fail, but you couldn't put an exact date on it. Is it efficient and is it low carbon? So if we have to be positive about most of that, keep it, but always plan for the future. No, start planning and budgeting now. So have we got more questions than answers? Well, good impartial advice. Obviously, many of you that I'm addressing will have DAC advisors like me. If you haven't, there are professionals that can help you. Try and get something impartial rather than tied to a particular product or solution. There are people out there, obviously, that want to sell a particular system, and you probably won't get the best impartial advice there. Record what you have and what you need now. Set a budget. You might need to be ambitious on the budget, or you might have to be realistic, but you need to know, really have an idea of what something is going to cost, and have a plan to reduce carbon. Now, I'm going to add last few slides now are about emissions, and then a little bit of a case study. And I've got a few minutes to go, so we should be all right. So, faculties, permissions, archdeacon licenses. So, list A, no permission. It has changed. So, works of maintenance, repair and adaptation not amounting to a substantial addition or replacement to heating systems, controls and so on. So you basically, all you can do to make it fairly simple is repair, but you can't add to, replace, and you certainly can't put a new replacement boiler under a list A. So like for like replacement of a non-fossil fuel system is on list A, but not a gas calor or oil boiler. So what's a non-fuel fossil fuel system? That's an electric system. So you can, change an electric, some electric storage heaters, for example, but you can't change a boiler. Archdeacon's license, and here's the publication that you need to refer to. Replacement of a fossil fuel with a non-fossil fuel boiler in the same or similar position. You can replace a gas tank, and you can replace under pew heaters for a new system. Obviously, there's a lot more detail in the publication, but that's the gist of it. And just about everything else is full faculty. So replacement of fossil fuel boiler, another fossil fuel boiler requires a full faculty, even like for like. And replacement of an oil tank actually requires a full faculty as well, because the question will be asked, why are we replacing this? What else can we do? Now, if you do make a faculty application, it must have due regard to key items on national guidance on net zero carbon. So in very simple terms, our Chancellor, and I certainly know my own diocese, our Chancellor does, look for a lower and zero carbon system and evidence that the parish has diligently considered all low carbon options. It's not good enough just to say we can only do this. Well, we can only do a gas boiler. There will be evidence. So this is where all the thinking through comes in, because you document that, and that's what the Chancellor will be looking for as justification for why you want to do that particular thing. And so just to finish off, last minute or two, as Catherine mentioned, I did do some case studies for the Diocese of St Albans, which was really, really interesting. St Albans chose 4 churches that were quite different to represent the typical stock of churches across their diocese, but obviously fairly typical for all other dioceses as well. So here we have a major parish church with a substantial church hall in use most days. It has plans to change and expand its use. The system is at the end of its life and actually not working at all. So after much discussion, we looked at viable options. We had air-to-water heat pumps, ground source heat pumps for the church, air-to-air heat pumps for the hall. And again, I haven't got time right now to explain what all of those are, but come on Thursday and all will be explained. A hybrid of the two. Now, what often doesn't get considered is a hybrid solution. Very often a hybrid solution is the best, because you are sizing your expensive renewable system for most of the time, but you're not oversizing it for the odd days in the year when it really is cold. And therefore it makes it a lot more affordable, whilst at the same time reducing carbon. And we also look at virtually every visit whether there's a potential for photovoltaic solar panels to assist. And then we looked at the emitters. Fan convectors work in a lot of spaces because they're very compact. Radiators and potentially underfloor heating here. So we come from a long list of options to a short list of options, and then we look at what the carbon implications are. So suitability. Is it suitable? We use a structured interview. We engage with key representatives. That's really important. It's not good just to talk to the one person of a church. You need to try and get the full range of opinion. We need to think about phasing, what could be done in bite-sized chunks. Then we looked at a completely different church, a church located on a estate, built in the 50s, no pews, as you can see, end of life again. Brilliant opportunity for solar PV there because it's unlisted, although it is not an area of architectural interest. And would really work with the sort of community use it has with an air source heat pump with the lower temperature emitters. So I think I've expended my time to allow for some questions. Here's some key sources to look at, and I hope you found that interesting, and I very much look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much. As ever, your practical wisdom shines through. Now, everybody listening, there's quite a few questions already. So it's worth you going in, having a look at the Q&A, see if there are ones there that are similar to your questions. If there are, give them a thumbs up. Those ones will go to the top of the list. If there isn't a question there that hits the spot, then please do add a new question. We've got just over 10 minutes and there's already 12 questions in there, so we will do our best. Now, it's not the one at the top, but I just thought it was a really good place to start, because it's the kind of thing everybody needs to understand. Michael has asked, what is a DAC advisor? We all take that for granted, don't we? We're so used to it, we just assume everybody knows. Susan, what is a DAC advisor?
Well, if your diocese has one, it's normally a voluntary thing that first of all, let's start off with what a DAC is. Diocesan Advisory Committee, the body that looks at changes to churches. And within that, there will be members and advisors who have a particular area of expertise, which they make available to churches, generally, as I say, apart from the buildings advisor, which is a paid post, generally the DAC advisors are unpaid. In my case, I'm obviously building services engineer, and I've offered my time to Worcester Diocese, but many dioceses have the equivalent of me. If they're very lucky, they might have several of them, and will normally be willing to come along and offer some impartial advice. They won't design a system, and they won't give you much costs for us. They won't give you budget costs generally, but they will give you impartial advice about what would be appropriate. write a little report as well, and which is ratified by the DAC normally. So it's pretty useful to, if you've got a DAC advisor, to start there. The other thing I'd say is that when we get a faculty application, if I've already done an advisory visit, it doesn't half make the process much easier, because the application will normally get delegated to me, or possibly my electrical advisor as well. And we can just say, oh yes, we've been there, we've seen that, the church has taken our advice, yeah, recommend.
And I've put a link into the chat to the map of all the dioceses and the contact detail for your DAC secretary for every diocese. So if you don't already know how to contact your DAC, click through on that, you'll see the map, scroll down, find your diocese. Right, so the first question then says, what about heated pew cushions?
Brilliant things, love them, great. Please use more of them. They're not that common, I think they're great. They do deliver heat to where people are very effectively. They don't warm the air temperature. So some churches will find that they are not warm enough with them in isolation. But with them, you can either reduce the temperature, the air temperature, or go to a low carbon source for taking the chill off otherwise. So they are a very good, they're part of the palette of solutions. Then in some cases they might be a solution on their own if you can cope with pretty low temperatures, but the majority of cases will require them in conjunction with something else. But Covo Schmidt is the only one I know of in the UK, or that offers in the UK. But yeah, I recommend them on a very regular basis.
And there's two slightly different things. There's pew cushions where you have permanent pews that are in one place and the cushions get wired into the electricity. And Covo Schmidt's the one I know of as well. We've got one case study of that on our website. But there's another thing that we've just coming to the end of a pilot of at the moment, which are portable battery powered chair cushions, and those can move anywhere because they're not wired in. And just coming to the end of a pilot to see how they perform.
Yeah, there's carpets that do that as well. Little carpet you can put your feet on. Yeah.
And I'll just find a link whilst Susan's answering the next question. I'll share a link in
Which one do you want me to go to next?
Right, so the next one says, so this isn't really a heating question. This is, are PV solar panels unlikely to be approved by the DAC if a Victorian church is grade 2 listed? I'm not sure that you would want to touch on that one, Susan. It's a PV question rather than a heating question, and we've got a special webinar just on that.
Yeah, I think PVs is a bigger question. I think that Historic England are starting to change. I think the diocese views, I think there's been a bit too much preciousness about the view. So I think it is starting to change. And I think it's, I think it's being challenged, but I don't know what's happening out there big time, apart from the fact that we are seeing more going there. What I always say at this point is try, if you think it's going to be a problem on the church roof, is there anywhere else you can put it? Like a church hall. A church hall is always the best place to put PV by far. But also, don't dismiss ground mounted ones either. There are sometimes locations for them. So, think creatively about PV. It's usually worth doing.
The next question is about solar panels as well, that says, how much value is there adding solar panels when considering the heating, given that when it's cold, there is less sunlight? So that really depends on whether your usage pattern of your church, if you've got a lot of daytime usage when the sun's shining, then great. If all of your usage is in the evening, then solar panels might not be the right solution for your church.
No, and also, but I would say that solar panels do generate electricity even as long as they're unshaded in overcast skies.
Right. So the next question I'm going to, in your list of viable options, you don't mention infrared. Are they not suitable? They appear to be a good option with a quick warm up and low carbon. On Thursday, when you're talking about how to choose a solution, does infrared come up then?
Very much so, yes. Yeah, I haven't really, I haven't talked about solutions today. That yes, it does. It's the top one, but yeah.
That's the plug. Come back on Thursday.
Yeah.
We have, this is Dave saying, we have electric underpew heating that works really well. Good to hear. We have an old oil boiler beyond repair and an oil tank. Do we need any permissions to remove the oil boiler and oil tank?
No, you don't need permissions to remove it, I don't think. Well, you need list A, I suppose, but not to remove, I don't think. I don't think so.
I'll have to check. I'll get the list up. If I can find it in time, I'll
In very practical terms, what I would say is that oil must be disposed of in an environmentally responsible manner and not left in the tank. And you must, know where your oil is going. So also, an old boiler could have asbestos. So what I don't like to see is people leaving this stuff in situ for the next generation to deal with. So in my diocese, it will be, can we leave it there? It's no. I think you should dispose of it responsibly. I think it's the right thing to do.
Right, the disposal of gas and oil tanks is under A.
Yeah.
A7, matter 8. So it's on list A, which means that you can get on with it. In summary, right, the next question says, can you recommend some churches to visit to see a recently installed low carbon system? To visit is a little bit trickier. We've got our case studies page, which I've just put a link in chat, but then we've also got the renewables map. Let me
I'd also say ask your DAC.
Absolutely true, yeah.
Because they will know where they've passed faculties for. So, get in touch with the DAC secretary on that one too.
Very good point. So this is the renewables map. I can put a link to it in the chat in a second. When you go into the renewables map, everything on here is either solar or heat pumps or one of the other things listed up here, and you can filter. So you can filter by diocese, you can filter by technology, and you can filter by listing. The information in here is only as good as what we've got, so it might be missing some, but hopefully that can help you find ones in your local area. Right, the next, I have to shut the questions in order to share my screen. Pipe organs. Please advise the best temperature and humidity for a big pipe organ.
I'm going to pass on that and say that's the question for the organ advisor, who will know that much better than I could. The main thing I do know about pipe organs is stability is more important than the absolute humidity and temperature. So we're back to not wanting to have big swings in temperature. Humidity goes along with temperature generally. So if you get a big swing in temperature, you'll get a big swing in humidity. Steady and stable, but not necessarily that warm, I would say. But in terms of absolute temperature terms, I would ask the organ advisor on that one, because there are different requirements for different types of organs, that much I do know, and the components of them.
Wise advice.
And if it's an important one, there may be more stringent requirements.
Right. How have we got? We've got 2 minutes left, so probably one more question. This question from John. We don't have a boiler. Can you comment on the relative efficiency of using separate gas burners?
I'm not quite sure what's meant by separate gas burners there. Do we mean gas heaters like the Drugasar and
yes, I assume so.
Volcana type thing? Yeah, they're not too bad. They're sort of okay-ish, the modern ones, but they fail, and they tend to fail expensively sometimes. In general, we should be thinking about getting away from gas anyway. So I wouldn't probably advise on a new installation unless there was absolutely unless there's no other option. And again, the one good thing about them is you can replace them piecemeal. So I would normally, in that instance, look at piecemeal replacement with an air-to-air heat pump.
which again is a beautiful plug for coming on Thursday. Think about what to replace it with. Now, I'm conscious, I think 2 or 3 of the questions I haven't got to are about biomass, so I'm going to pop in there. I know this isn't as good as getting your own answer, but I've popped a link in the chat through to our biomass guidance, because that is 5 o'clock. Sorry if you haven't had your question answered. There were a lot of questions there. We've done our best. Susan, thank you as always, bringing your practical wisdom and experience to bear on these complicated matters, but you help break it down step by step. Everyone who's joined, thank you so much for coming. I do hope that a lot of you are booked on to come back on Thursday or the second run at the end of June of topic 2. I think the 2 things together are a really useful combination of topics of should we replace, and if so, what with. I've saved the chat. I'll send you all the slides and the links that were in the chat, and I've already got a link to the recording of the first time that Susan ran this webinar, so I can share that with you. Thank you for coming, and I will bring us to a close. Goodbye.
Thank you.